Welcome to this Considered Opinions podcast.
I'm Dougal.
And I'm Celia. Thank you for joining us.
Today we're going to be considering history. Celia, I often hear these days the phrase, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. What's your take on that?
I have a problem with that phrase because I find it very oblique. What does it actually mean? It sounds neat and it sounds clever, but I don't think it has a very profound or meaningful interpretation.
So the older phrase, history often repeats, what do you get from that then?
It's actually quite a comforting phrase because when things seem scary or messed up, then you can tell that you've been there before.
And what role I've always thought that history is all about learning the lessons of the past so that you don't repeat them.
Well, isn't that the phrase, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it?
Yes.
I think the other thing that phrase about history rhyming actually does is it allows you to gloss over history and focus on the present. Because if it's not a repetition, then you have nothing to learn from the past.
Right, because nothing's ever exactly the same, therefore you can always excuse away any patterns that you see.
I think the rhyme thing is about, there's echoes, things echo each other, there's a similarity there, but really, and that's a surface similarity, but really deep down and underneath things are different and everything's new and everything's unique today. But that causes you then to focus on the present and not learn the lessons of history.
So would part of that lesson be something like, World War II, we learned a lot about tyrants and what tyrants do, and yet we seem to have forgotten that, certainly over the last 3 or 4 years.
Well, I think the phrase, lest we forget, is another one of those. It's let us off the hook. It's meant that we haven't needed to actually remember because we keep telling ourselves we are, but we're so focused on remembering to remember rather than the actual remembering.
Right. So you can't substitute, or there is no substitute for actual learning of the history and the words or the ritual of saying lest we forget. That just by saying that doesn't mean that you all of a sudden imbibe all of the wisdom of the last 100-odd years.
Exactly. And the lest we forget phrase is often used for remembrance services, and the focus is on that service. Yes. Rather than on actually learning the history and actually passing on the values that those fallen servicemen fought for.
Yes.
That was so important that they gave their lives for those values. And so we're not focusing on learning the values and passing them on to our children. We're focused on attending a Anzac Day service or wearing a poppy. And I'm not saying that those things aren't good and important, but they're meaningless if you don't really understand the history, what went on, and then passing on those values.
It reminds me of an experience we had where we were at a place doing a tasting, and there was within the material that they had, they gave us a little sheet with the sort of historical information, and they had a picture of Joseph Stalin, and you piped up and said, that's Joseph Stalin. And the guy that was doing the tasting was shocked that you actually knew who Joseph Stalin was, which then meant that we were shocked because we couldn't believe that a lot of people don't know who Joseph Stalin was.
That's another thing to think about with history repeating. Stalin was from Georgia and became the dictator in Russia.
Yes.
Hitler was from Austria, became the dictator in Germany.
Napoleon
was from Corsica, became the dictator in France.
Oh, there we go.
Alexander was
Macedon, Alexander of Macedon.
And he became the ruler of Greece.
Yes, interesting point. So they were all coming from outside the nation or the society from which they ended up ruling. So I suppose that's an example of if you just took a superficial look at history, you would just go, oh, they're a dictator, all dictators are bad, and you would miss this nuance.
And the threads, I think, show human nature. And that's something that I often say is that it doesn't matter what time period you're looking at, humans are humans are humans are humans. And we always have been and always will be human. And so there are certain things that you can almost rely on people doing.
Yes. So, I mean, is there a risk then that if you learn the broad sweep of history that you might miss certain things, that you end up with a good understanding of, facts and figures over a broad period of time, but you miss the nuance, miss the deeper lessons?
I don't think you have a good understanding if you're just talking the broad sweep of history, because basically you've got an outline and you need to know what's inside. You need to know the way people thought and behaved. So you need to know, Charlotte Mason actually talks about this, about history, is to avoid teaching the outline of history and actually really get to know a time period or a person. Yes. And how that person thinks, if there's writings from them. Obviously it's harder to understand how Alexander thinks, but you could read Winston Churchill, or you could read Julius Caesar, or you could read Cicero. There is a lot of getting in touch with that mind that throughout history there's a lot of figures you can choose from. But when you really understand how he's thinking and the mindset that they have at that time, one of the things that happens is you actually realise that they're not too different from today. But two, you also realise that what's going on at other places at the same time, that helps to give you a fuller picture as well.
Give context, adds context. So when you're learning history, rather than learning a broad sweep, what would you recommend?
Choose something that interests you, that you're naturally already drawn to, and just spend time finding out about that time period. Read the writings of it if you can. Find out about how people lived. I've spent some time with the Romans, and you actually discover that, did you know the Romans had burgers?
Burgers.
They were very big on street food, and they called them isikia, which is like a meatball, but you could get it between two pieces of bread from a stall.
There we go.
Essentially. They've dug up in Pompeii, basically a takeaway.
A takeaway. In Pompeii.
People in Pompeii, they lived in apartments, but of course because cooking was done with an open flame, there was a fire hazard. So there was no cooking facilities in your apartment. So people ate street food. So you would go out to eat.
Ah, there we go.
So the street food that they've got, and those big containers for the food in the counter.
Yes.
And some of them still have the petrified food in there from when Vesuvius erupted. But it's interesting that it's not actually too dissimilar. If you take the 1190s in London, there was places that they produced ready meals, and it was open 24 hours. So if you had an unexpected visitor, basically you could pop down to this particular shop and pick up a cooked meal and bring it back and feed them.
TV meals in 1190 without TV. There we go. So these are the sorts of in-depth sort of realizations that you're talking about, that there is consistency throughout history. So if you're learning eras in depth, do you learn the same lessons as when you're learning a broad sweep?
What you'll find is that things will keep recurring and that things come in cycles. And that's a comforting thought when things are looking a bit dire, that it's not a downward trajectory that there's no hope from coming back from. It's that things go around again.
Right. So if you're looking at things superficially, you might be more inclined to believe in an arrow of time sort of model of the world, whereas if you learn in depth, I guess you're not talking about learning one area in depth, but we understand our own, perhaps. You learn another. There's two. And then you learn a third era, then you're starting to see that it's cycles and there's similarities, and it starts to, you move away from that arrow of time simplistic model.
Yes. The other thing that is interesting when you start to learn things in depth is you can see the myths that are told today about the past. And so you can take, for example, the fact that people might say that 200 years ago, we're so lucky to live now, because 200 years ago, people lived in poverty.
Yes.
And
Well,
that
isn't that
90% of the population lived in poverty. Well, the definition of poverty is the important thing. To be poor 200 years ago, the definition was, and so 90% of the population at least were
considered poor by this definition of the time.
And the definition is that you had to work for your living, and that if you did not work, you would fall into debt and lose your house.
Isn't that everyone at the moment? According to that definition of 200 years ago, where 90% would still be in poverty.
I think we live in a great time. We're alive at a great period of history, but also we don't need to be arrogant that we have nothing to learn from the past,
yes.
or that we're so much better. Another phrase that people say often is, in this day and age.
I hate that phrase. I hate that phrase. You know I hate that phrase.
It's a phrase where it's suggesting that we're so much more advanced.
Yes.
And we used to be Neanderthals, and now we are some kind of enlightened human being.
So what about, if we're not wanting to do the broad sweep history, there's another way that people will phrase it, is that, they'll learn about the great man history or the great men history, where you're just learning the important events, the battles,
and the big names
and things like that.
I think that's quite a outline history, because you're just learning the big names and the dates.
And so you run into that same problem of learning your history superficially.
Do you know how Alfred the Great thought? What sort of cakes did he burn?
Yes. And therefore, how do you fully understand his frame of mind, and therefore
Why did he burn the cakes?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. Why did he burn He wasn't paying attention, I suppose.
Why was he not paying attention?
He was busy thinking about the battle ahead, I don't know.
He was busy thinking about strategies. Yes, and statesmanship. Absolutely. That's why he burnt the cakes. But if you don't know that, somebody can say to you, Alfred the Great is just an example of how useless men are in the kitchen.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, you draw the wrong conclusions. I like to pull back a lot of examples to sort of World War II lessons, and drawing the wrong lessons from history that I like to sort of talk about when it comes to World War II is that after World War II, the West didn't really understand a lot of what happened on the Eastern Front, the fight between Russia and Germany. They couldn't really talk to or listen to or study very much in depth the Russian interpretation of that, because the Cold War kicked in very quickly. So what ended up happening is that a lot of the Germans, who were the defeated generals, went to the West, and they were the ones who wrote the books that were studied in the universities and the military academies about what happened on the Eastern Front. And they had a vested interest in making them look good and trying to slough off any blame for the failure of the German military on the Eastern Front on other people. And
Funnily enough, if they had learnt their history, they'd have known that the Swedes tried to do it. And the reason why the Swedes, and Napoleon as well.
Yes.
And they all three, Swedes, then Napoleon, then Hitler, all three suffered the same fate: overstretched supply lines and winter.
Yes. I guess one of the ways that they sloughed it off is that they just blamed Hitler and said he was a madman. And so we have this myth coming out of World War II that Hitler was a madman, and that gets people off scot-free for the fact that actually there were a lot of people underneath Hitler who fully were invested in the ideology, the National Socialist Party, where it had a fully formed ideology.
Also, the other thing, you mentioned mythology around the Second World War, and I think that we do mythologize it, and the disadvantage of that is that in the mythology we have the whole story of how it ended up. But when you start to spend time learning about a time period, say the Second World War, reading diaries, reading first-hand accounts of what's going on, you really get the feel that they don't know what's going to happen.
Yes.
And so for us, in our lives, we don't know what's coming in the future, but we can not be afraid of what's coming because We know that people during the Second World War didn't know what was coming either, but whatever happens, they were able to deal with it at the time. And we can learn from that just as they were able to deal with these terrible things happening, if terrible things happen to us down the line, we will be able to deal with them.
Some people might counter that. The doomsayers would counter that and say, "Oh, well, that didn't work out very well for the Jews in the concentration camps." But we even still know their thoughts in the concentration camps, because some people did survive and some people did write down. So we can still, even in that, what most people would consider the most dire example in history, we still actually know what the people that went through the hell that was concentration camps were thinking.
Yes, and what they experienced.
So to sum up, what would you say are the most important things that you would encourage people to focus on with history?
Focus on a time period. Get to know it really well. Whatever it is that you're interested in. If it's World War II, if it's the Napoleonic Wars, if it's, there's a joke going around at the moment that ask your husband how often he thinks about the Roman Empire. If it's the Roman Empire, whatever it is that you are interested in and you find fascinating, get to know that time period a bit better. How people lived, what they thought, and what was going on at that time in other places as well, to give you a fuller picture.
Give context to the era as well.
What you're looking for is that common humanity. Those stories that tell you that those people were people just the same as you and me.
Yeah. And the benefits that people will get from doing that.
They'll get a sense of perspective. They'll get a great pleasure, I think, from discovering that the Romans ate burgers from street stalls.
Yes.
The sense of continuity the next time you have a burger and think,
people have been doing this for literally thousands of years.
Thank you for joining us for this Considered Opinions podcast. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.